Yes, one thing that strikes me is um, I look back on things not only as having sort of different significance, as with Otto Luning or Vincent Persichetti, um, but having just plain more significance than I realized at the time. Like the first of those has to do with just my basic upbringing in my house. My mother was, in fact, Cleveland's ace teacher of children on the violin. And I mean, she had 4-year-olds who were really doing well. They had to be very talented because by the time I was very conscious of things, she already had enough reputation that she could pick and choose her students. And I remember I accompanied the last inept students she ever taught. They were the Johnson boys. It was 2 of them, and they just did not have a lot of talent. And that was the last time I ever saw people that did not have a lot of talent. Her 4-year-olds were just knockouts. And she tended to keep a student up through the Mendelssohn Concerto. And then she would pass the students, you know, age 13 or whatever, to an artiste. Or the artiste would come snooping around and steal the student. Before that, you got Miggy was that's my mother, was very much in that world that I described for sessions, composition teaching, that students were the teacher's students, and you didn't thief somebody else's student. And when it would happen, when a student of yours went to some other teacher, this was scandalous. That was one thing that was great around Princeton. Following Roger Sessions' reign here, which was very loose and mild, where only Roger taught composition, Milton sort of inherited his mantle, although at the time equally divided among Milton, Ed Cohn, and Earl Kim. And immediately the policy was established that every student should study with each of us in turn. And I mean, that was great, and that was a really radical step. Maybe it's the sort of thing that people don't understand about Milton. Definitely Milton was 100% into, and maybe was the originator of the idea that the students should study with each of us, not become the student of one of us. Also, people get the idea that Milton was teaching 12-tone, and in fact, it was very hard to get Milton to teach 12-tone. Remember a time when, not Phil Glass, but the other guy that you always say in the same breath. Reich. Thank you. Steve Reich was here, and it was at a summer electronic music thing, and he was a guest lecturer, and he came in and was talking and playing some of his stuff. He was reading to us an article he had just written for, I don't know, Groves or for the Oxford History of Music, where he was talking about what they used to do at Princeton. Well, he has no idea. But he said, oh, if you're a student at Princeton, you had to write 12-tone or aleatoric. I said, well, I mean, I think my statement about Milton needs to be available to the public to correct that. I mean, what's most interesting there, too, is a guy blowing hard like that, entirely on the basis of mythologies that float around as if that's knowledge he had. And, you know, he obviously never heard, he didn't know who I was. Did I say that? I mean, I didn't ask him. But, you know, it was just such a ridiculous idea. Oh, geez. And Earl Kim. I mean, 12 tone or aleatoric. I was never 12 tone. I certainly was very interested in Milton. He was why I came here. And what he did for me was to reinforce my constructivism with pitches that that had already laid eggs at Harvard and elsewhere. And he very much was a model for me in pursuing constructivism with pitches. What I didn't, what in fact really I felt I rejected about what Milton was doing was the 12 part, the 12 tone. I didn't want those 12 tones running around all the time. And in fact, since Milton's death, I finished a piece that's in memoriam Milton. It's called The Way It Was. And in fact, what that piece is doing is the closest to a little treatise I wrote about which I called pitch-derived rhythm, that I think may someday appear in open space. And it all had to do with threes, fours, fives, sevens, and how you break the one into the other, how you get a structure of this kind or that, how you go cycle of fifths equivalent, and everything like that. This piece I wrote in memoriam to Milton, in fact, really just, I would say, deletes from those ideas some very impractical and inhibiting things, and goes ahead and uses those ideas, which I would say are an excellent reflection of Milton's constructive attitude as distinct from his 12-tone attitude, which is just nowhere in sight, and makes for a very different effect. Okay, now I've sort of got parentheses within parentheses. How did I open this segment? With my mother.
With your
My mother.
The Johnson
and
boys.
reflecting back on things that changed. Right. It was always obvious to me the tremendous contribution that Milton was making to my life, both as a teacher and as a friend and colleague for years. However, with respect to my mother, I would have been pretty small, maybe only 4 or 5 years old, when she decided, okay, it's time to start James, as I was known around the house, on violin. And she tried to start me on violin. I insisted on holding the bow like a club. So she decided that maybe I wasn't showing the right attitude. Maybe she should put me on piano. So from then on, it was piano for me. But most importantly, it meant that by the time, who knows, I was 10 or 11, I was her in-house accompanist for all her students on the Saturday afternoon recitals or on the little tours to Elyria, Ohio, or whatever. And at the time, I guess I sort of thought that was fun, accompanying my mother's students. But in retrospect, I realized that all of that accompanying that I did was really a great thing for me on several counts. In the first place, I began to realize, especially after I encountered this disease among other people, when you grow up on piano, two things that are the opposite sides of the same coin happen. Number one, it's great because you're always practicing a piece of music in toto. You're not just practicing some little thread of it that eventually maybe you'll get together and hear from others what the piece sounds like. With piano, you're doing the whole thing. But on the other side there is The approach to the piano is unlike the violin, where you have to really listen carefully to every pitch you make, every stroke, every inch of, where you're really just fully into governing the sound, what's coming out. No, on piano, too many people learn piano by simply mastering the digital dexterity that's needed to push the right lever at the right time, and you don't have to worry. So that to counteract any possibility of that, having as an accompanist to listen to this person playing and you're trying to get with it, this was an invaluable thing to be instilled into me for a number of years and at an early age. So yeah, I always think back on all those accompanying sessions at the time. They merely seemed like things I did. They were not things to which the plaudits were attached. The plaudits were for you when you did solo. And this, I remember the one time that I got plaudits from a performer, just because I was listening and I was not dumb. A violinist on a recital had that horrible experience of forgetting, and briefly came to a halt, and somehow the violinist had in mind where he'd head under those circumstances. Well, we had never discussed it, but it seemed to me that's where he'd head. And you hardly knew that the violinist had made a mistake because I was just right there and we just continued on. And so from her I got plaudits, and that was nice. But usually accompanying was just something you did, and the soloist would collect plaudits and so forth. Yeah, I realized thinking back that that was certainly a really valuable thing to me that I did for years. Another person that I often think of that in retrospect I realized just conveyed a lot to me, and that was my protector in the U.S. Navy. During the Korean War, my father, who was a newspaper editor and seemed to know things and seemed to be able to nose around and find out things, he discovered that in order to dodge the draft, one thing you could do, and we were all very eager to dodge the draft, one thing you could do was take an audition in the U.S. Navy music program as a civilian. They would then accept or reject you. If they rejected you, you were still a civilian. That isn't, no harm, no foul. If they accepted you, you could enter. And what they guaranteed you was that after boot camp, which you would have to go through boot camp, you would then, as your first assignment, go to the U.S. Naval Music Conservatoire in Washington, D.C., where you would be a student for X months before they would ship you out. It was the administrative center for shipping out the bands that went with the big ships to play the Star-Spangled Banner in the morning. That was in theory. During World War II, when by the time those bands were formed and got on board, they would immediately be assigned to chipping paint on the side of the ship, and they could store their instruments and forget that. But anyway, my father found out about this, and I figured, okay, that sounds good, because the Korea was a land war, and I did not wish to participate. So into the Navy I go, went through boot camp, and then I came to the U.S. Navy School, was there as a student. I talked him out of putting me on bass drum because pianists, they put on bass drum. I talked him into giving me lessons on clarinet. And I forget, on a good day I could get a sound out of a clarinet, but that was it. I haven't got it for a clarinet. But after not too many months, they sent their theory department to see. And I walked into the front office and said, what you guys need is me. I said, I'll teach theory. And my protector there, his name was Jerry Bowen, he said, yeah, he's right. He says, what you need is him. He says, he can handle it. They said, okay, that's fine. And immediately I got, a more impressive rank sewed on my sleeve. And I then spent the rest of my Navy enlistment, 4 years, at the U.S. Naval Conservatoire in Washington, D.C. Jerry Bowen was a musician who had enlisted, really as a kid. I mean, he was just barely of age when he enlisted in World War II. So that he was looking forward to retirement. I mean, around the age of 40, he could retire on full, I forget what it is, 20, 25 years, and you retire on something like full pension. I mean, if you serve in the military, once you get out, you're home free. So Jerry had re-enlisted, and he was staying in the Navy, and he was in the music program. And he was an all-around musician. He was a guy who could hold his own with a jazz ensemble. I never heard him seriously try to play classical music, but he was very interested in composition. And one big thing he did for me, aside from getting me taken aboard the U.S. Naval Conservatoire, a serious thing that he got done for me, he listened to some music I was writing. I looked at the score, and he was a composer also. And he said, Jim, you've got the pianist's conception of the band or the orchestra as a uniform body of sound from top to bottom, and what you do with it is, you give instruments notes that are in their range in this even body of sound. He said, hey, it's not like that. He said, each instrument is a body of sound. It goes from what for it is low to high, etc., what we call tessitura. And he said, you're not, when you're writing your music, you're not thinking that way. And I said, okay, I put up with that for some reason. And I said, okay, what should I do? And he said, just get hold of and study carefully any score by Stravinsky or any score by Tchaikovsky. I thought that's pretty interesting. And again, having done that, and having listened to their music and other music all my life, I realized that was a hell of a smart recommendation. And by the time I got out into real life, I think I really had a hold of that problem. I remember when I was in Colorado for 6 months or 4 months later in life, there was some fellow that was composing and particularly wanted my suggestions about instrumentation. And gee, I realized that, without Jerry Bowen telling me what to go study and wise up, I'm not sure what I would have had to tell that guy. But I remember he just felt that what I was telling him, oh man, this was a revelation. Well, that's a direct descendant of Jerry Bowen, shaking this pianist loose from his various misconceptions. Jerry also, let's see, another thing he did for me. A buddy of his during World War II in the Navy, whom he had studied composition with, said he is now teaching at Catholic University there in Washington. Him you got to study with. So I said, okay, I've in the course of my life I've put up with famous people teaching me nothing, and here's a guy I never heard of. I said, go out there. Did I say Thad Jones? That was his name, and he's not in fact, the name was, I believe, George Thaddeus Jones. And there is, I believe, a very well-known jazz arranger named George Thaddeus Jones. Different man. This was George Thaddeus Jones, who was a composer and was teaching at Catholic U. And he had the best composition teaching method I ever heard of. He later published a book about composition where he had completely distorted it. But what happened with me was I went in with a few of my pieces, and he would make some criticisms, and I would think, no. I said, no, what I'm doing there is fine. And he finally said, well, Jim, he says, I don't think I got anything to teach you. And I said, well, okay, why don't you just tell me what you want me to do, and I'll go do that. Okay, so he told me, and I came back with something that did all that. And so then he said, all right, now, I notice in there that you're doing a lot of X and a lot of Y. So you never do Z or Q. And, no criticism. You probably shouldn't. You don't want Z and Q in there. Next week, you bring me back something that's doing a lot of Z and Q. And it kept going like that. Just, you're always working on what you've been avoiding. And, that was just great. And we got along just fine. And yeah, that was by way of Jerry Bowen. He died a number of years ago. I used to exchange Christmas cards with him, and he once visited us here in Princeton. He basically retired, like most Navy people, to San Diego. But he visited once. And so I like to remember Jerry because he really offered me a lot. And he was a guy who was just an intelligent, composing, all-around musician, working in the trenches, kind of, who really was able to convey to me things that I needed and had no idea I needed. And that was good.
Was he the guy who didn't have a perfect pitch?
There you go. I can give you two quickies about Jerry. I was practicing the piano in one of these little Navy cubby holes one day, and I think I shared the office with him. And he walked in, and he said, that music you're playing is either in A flat or A major or E major. I said, yeah. I said, that's right. It is. And I said, what's this? How do you and that's a funny thing. He says, oh, well, says, those are the keys that sound like that. There was another time we were sitting, and as you can gather from that story, he did not have perfect pitch, or he would have told me which of those it was. No, he was doing it by something else. We were sitting at a band rehearsal, and, they're doing their thing up there. And by band, I mean, a Navy band, 35 clarinets. And at a certain point he says to me, hey, did you hear that low B? And I said, well, what low B are you doing? That low B in the bassoon. And I said, well, yeah, I guess I did. I said, but how did you know it was a B? And he said, well, there's no other note that sounds like that on the bassoon. And, that also, that would orient me towards keeping lively aspects of things that maybe, especially, you're sitting in offensive band rehearsal. Nevertheless, you're lively to things that you're picking up and noticing. And yeah, I think Jerry did a lot of that, and that was a great thing. My entry into computer music, way back when I was a granddaddy thereof, was a little different from the entry of other people that I found working in the field, of whom there were a few. The reason that I wanted to go to the computer had nothing to do with the idea of here is this new kind of ability to generate sound which can thereby be exploited in some completely different way from what we did, and a whole new attitude towards music. Like my friend Walter Bronke, who I should talk about a little more, with whom I have, in fact, what would you say? I have written a contribution to a book by Walter that we hope one of these days will come out in open space. Walter approaches the computer as something which makes possible something that was never before possible. And now he's doing his own special kind of thing down that road. But back, in the 50s, I guess, that sort of attitude among very different sorts of composers was very prevalent. That is, that what you're trying to do is that which this medium makes possible and therefore demands. And especially, you do not want to do those things that regular instruments and so forth can do. I mean, Walter finds it very strange to discover people still approaching the computer with scores on 5-line staves. I mean, that's old stuff that the computer makes possible a total alternative to. Well, that was not my way in. My way in, I remember it very specifically. I wanted my damned pitches and rhythms to be played accurately for a change. You have to think back to this era. There were not a lot of these groups as there are now that had young, hotshot performers whose specialty was contemporary music and extended resources on their instruments. I mean, you could just do all these amazing things. You have ensembles like that now. That wasn't the way. Contemporary music back then was something that established performers groaned when they had to play, and they would rehearse as little as possible. With symphony orchestras, I know perfectly well from my associations with the Cleveland Orchestra when I was a kid, that they would have the occasional week that was known as Contemporary Music Week. And that was the week they didn't have to take anything home to practice it, because they would just sight read. And if they made a lot of mistakes, neither the conductor nor the composer nor anybody else could tell that they were doing all these mistakes. Okay, in recent days, this whole spiel, I hope, doesn't apply to anything, although I could apply it a little bit. But my intention towards the computer was sort of that I wanted a perfect performer for a change. I wanted this to happen the way I wanted it to happen. So consistent with that, I needed, obviously, technical assistance here, because I was not interested in all the wiring and whatnot. programming, that struck me as okay. I'm willing to think because I have all kinds of logical things that I'm happy to have a way to deal with. But right away, I thought of the person that I want to join me in this and sort of do the heavy thinking. And that was a graduate student of my very years at Princeton, student of Milton's, named Godfrey Wynnum. And we have subsequently, in the Princeton Music Department, named our electronic music lab the Wynnum Lab because of Godfrey's contributions in those days. Now, you should understand, Godfrey didn't know any more about electric wiring than I did, and probably a little less about computer programming, because I think maybe I had already been horsing around with it a little bit. I'm not sure. But anyway, he had to learn it from scratch. But as I suspected, Godfrey, with a tremendous brain and ability to learn and get to the heart of things and just to reason well, Godfrey would manage to do this in a way that would be supportive of music rather than destructive of it. And that worked out very well. Godfrey did some programming. He rewrote he rewrote Max Matthews' computer music manual to suit our facilities here. And by the way, Max contributed greatly to us down here. When I was first learning to do this, I went up to Max's department at Bell Labs. He assigned an assistant of his named Joan, oh Lord, was her name Miller? Joan Miller, I think, to teach me everything I need to know, and they gave me time on their computer to do it. I used to wander around. I'd sometimes stay a little after the office went home, still doing things, and I was wandering around in rooms that were loaded with these fat digital tapes and like labeled Telstar. I forget what else, but I mean, this was before security had really set in a big way, and Bell Labs was a place where they were doing this really mind-blowing stuff in mind-blowing fields. So anyway, Max had me up there for a while, and then Max contributed their old converter, which was a machine that got you from digital to sound, right there in the room. He contributed their old converter to us, so that we then became a self-sufficient operation. But I wanted Godfrey to take over the heavy thinking and the heavy programming because I knew he was a great mind and a fine musician and composer. He was not a hard wiring nut. And my whole relation to computer music sort of stayed that way. What I wanted was the music that I wanted, and in that sense, I'm a throwback. I'm still sort of stuck in attitudes towards music that emerged from interest in what was called modern music in the teens, 20s, and 30s. There was a point where John Chowning, and a fellow named Roberts, and somebody up in Boston, I don't know, we were the computer music guys. The world wasn't full of them. And when I did lyric variations for violin and computer, it was pretty clear that, I mean, the computer had not yet been used for music at that level. I'd say that was clear, if not to others, to me, but also to some others. And I was attending conferences. I mean, when you had a conference about computer music, whether it was down in Washington or out in San Francisco or wherever the hell, I was one of the people that you would get there. And I remember very distinctly, I was at one in San Francisco, listening to the papers being read and the ideas being expressed and the examples being played by these people who were specialists in the developing field of computer music. And I forgot all about this experience until very recently, when my colleague and friend Scott Burnham asked me, well, had I ever had the experience of sort of kicking the habit and going to something else, just deciding, I don't want to do that anymore. And I told him, no, I said, my life has been pretty good. And then I thought about it and I realized, well, wait a minute. At that conference in San Francisco, I remember skipping a couple of sessions and just walking around looking at San Francisco and thinking about the point, what the hell am I doing up here with those people? And so I can remember very specifically the next conference for electronic whatnot was being arranged with a composer and a guy interested in the computer who had designed the computer to produce 12-tone phenomena, named Gus Chiamaga, very nice fellow, Canadian. I described to him something or other that could be involved in the next get-together. And then I said to him, and it's all yours. I said, you know, forget me. And he was a little bit hurt and offended, I think. But that was it. That was the end of that. So in short, identifying me as a computer music guy must be appended with a grain of salt, because I was using the computer, but in that spirit, and just the whole culture of, you know, wow, listen to this, something or other, was just offensive to me. And again, that sort of goes back to, I could imagine Leonard Schuer being exposed to this, you know. I mean, that just wasn't what music was about. And I agree, that's not what music is about. One thing that was especially attractive to me about using the computer, and this horrifies people of technological bent, you could do it on punched cards. When I'd walk into a tape studio, and in those days, you know, tape music was a big deal. People were putting it in, and listen to a sawtooth tone going like that, and they're turning knobs and get, listen to this filter. I couldn't take it. And I was delighted that the computer enabled me to work soundlessly. Just, you know, think what I'm after, make the score, or make whatever I had to make, pencil on paper, go type up punched cards, take it from there. I liked that aspect. And the idea that you would turn in your deck of cards for this composition you bring, and in a matter of hours, this would come back to you as something you could hear. I compared that with the point that when I was writing as a youth, if you could find some people to play what you had just written and actually get it played within a few years of writing it. And this is all if. That was really good news. Wow. You know, you must be a famous composer or something like that. So that the idea that within a few hours I could have this come back to me perfectly performed, so that anything I didn't like was my fault, and I could now go back, punch some cards, try it that way. That to me was just great, and what a revelation. I remember a composer named Ed Duggar who had a great talent for just sound quality, writing for instrumental ensembles and making them really, you know, do all kinds of things like that. He was using the computer for a while here, and I can picture Ed sitting out in the hall just looking dismal because he had to wait 6 hours before he could hear this come back. That just seemed to him intolerable. I guess he had more experience being directly in there with instruments. I don't know. He couldn't take that. It was so slow. And of course, by now, when we all work directly on sound, you don't wait 6 hours for nothing. You're in there working on it just as definitely as a sculptor is working on what he's going to get. So that's a huge evolution. See, was there something else? I should mention that Godfrey really did become a master programmer for musical purposes, and he learned an awful lot of stuff about the physics of sound so that he could write programming to deal with questions that hadn't yet been dealt with well in programming. I remember one summer he gave a whole course that we were attending like every other day or something for a number of weeks that was just great. And he was taught, I think the subject was digital filters. In other words, how you use the computer to simulate filters. Okay? Where did he start in his explanations? And this was Godfrey. He started with number theory, and especially negative numbers. So that in order to get Godfrey's level of understanding, which was the only kind of thing that was of value to me, you had to go back there and start getting straight some things in what I guess counts as elementary mathematics, but in branches of mathematics that are not what you had in junior high school.
Set theory.
Number theory. And pretty soon, I mean, it seems to me I to the pi I squared, the cube root of, that seems to me that came up all the time. And by God, you had to understand, well, I guess I is the square root of -1. You had to understand what that was all about. And then E is, I don't even remember how you find that. Logarithms to the base E. I mean, yeah, this common mathematical chatter, but you had to know it and right to follow. But he would end up with the programs that would enable you to do digital filters and understand in the programming, what your variables were to deal with this. So I got that far in following Godfrey. It was not like I was ever in the position that I think composers are frequently in at EarCom, where they're assigned a technician, and that technician, in the end, really feels, and resentfully, that he, the technician, composed that piece. Like what the composer did was say, well, it's sort of swishy there. I think that's what goes on there. And that was never what I was doing. I never said to Godfrey, make it kind of swishy. I said, show me how this program for digital filters works.
Now, was Godfrey a mathematician? Was he a musician, or did he sort of?
Musician.
He was
Absolutely.
the base
Student of
student.
Hans Keller in London
okay,
as a kid.
and he came here to
Yeah.
attend the graduate school. And,
Yep. Came here. He was an undergraduate at Princeton, and then went into graduate school. And he and Dave Lewin and I were, along with one or two other people, were, the graduating class from graduate school in a certain year. That was a good crew. Hey, and I wanted to mention, I've now named a few people. I've named Leonard Shure, Godfrey, Dave Lewin. Those are people, Milton, these are people who have died, whether recently or, in Godfrey's case, decades ago, to whom I have dedicated pieces. And I feel very good about that, those four guys have pieces of mine that I think very highly of, that are in memoriam to them. Hey, one thing I forgot, important from my Columbia days, when I was suffering with auto-looning, not only did I go to Bill Mitchell and ask how to get out of this, but I heard in a radio performance, as one did in those days, the pianist-composer Leo Smit playing with the New York Philharmonic a new concerto by Alexei Hayev. That concerto by Alexei Hayev, I suppose it's been virtually lost, a great piece that certainly should be preserved. When I think of it, it's sort of as if Webern were working on Gershwin, and I think neither of those composers meant a thing to Alexei. But the piece is just a tight, rugged, marvelous piece. And I do retain somehow taped record of it or something like that. But, it doesn't float around. But I heard this performance on the radio, and I was suffering with auto-looning, and Alexei's phone number was in the phone book. So I called him up, and I told him my name, and I said, I heard your piano concerto the other day, and it's tremendous. I said, do you have composition students? And he said, oh, no. He says, I think he was well-to-do, and he said, well, no, he never took students. And I said, well, you got one now. And, he protested a little bit, but then he agreed, well, all right, if I insisted, I could come see him. And so, we got along fine, and for, I don't know, maybe, I bet you it was no more than 6 or 8 lessons that I had with Alexei Hayev. But that was a very nice interlude, because it was a rational man who, in fact, had done some wonderful composing. You could relate to. And so, I studied with Alexei briefly. And then I would hear from Milton that Alexei would frequently ask, how's Jim Randall doing? And that was nice to hear.
Now, when you were in New York City, you came from Cleveland. Did you participate much in the New York music scene? Did you go out to concerts?
Sure. Went
was
out
it exciting?
to concerts and French movies. Coming from Cleveland, we went to a place on 96th Street called the Thalia, It's probably still there. I don't think it still is just French movies, but that's when it was then. Yeah, so we saw all the Louis Jouvet movies impossible. Children of Paradise we saw there. And absolutely we went to concerts. The Juilliard Quartet was beginning to play all the Bartok quartets. The bebop scene was just emerging. This was before Birdland, where we went for the really hot stuff was called the Royal Roost. And, it was just a nice nightclub. I guess Birdland was an auditorium. I was never in it. I don't know. It was named for Charlie Parker, but I was in attendance during the earlier years of bebop. I remember the radio show. DJ named Freddie Robbins, who of course named his show The Robin's Nest, and his thing was bebop. I mean, the way DJs tended to be. They were pushing their line of goods. And I remember him announcing that we should all be getting together next month because Billie is getting out. That's Billie Holiday, was her 5-year sentence or whatever was over. And we should. I remember his advertising midnight concert at Carnegie Hall by Thelonious Monk. And oh yeah, we were on to Thelonious back in those days. Thought he was great. And yeah, also I don't remember theater too well, but we certainly were going to theaters. Yeah, I mean the abundance of just all kinds of action in the arts in New York, and also all kinds of bookstores. All of that about New York. And restaurants. Hey, you betcha that landed on a guy from Cleveland like a ton of bricks and was really great. And in fact, the dormitories were pretty old-fashioned and primitive. I was in a room, I think all my time there, up on the top 9th floor of one of the residence halls. I had not one but 2 roommates with me, and in one of our rooms, I don't know, a couple of bunks and another bunk, and if you looked out the window, you looked right smack down 116th Street to the river. So, even under those conditions, we had what felt like a great open view of the fabulous New York City.